Today on the subject of I'll start again. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May Breakfast Club webinar on the subject of food security. Food security is a very topical and timely subject, and once again, we're very grateful to Roythorn Solicitors for sponsoring this entire series of the NSA Breakfast Club. I'm also grateful to our speakers this morning, and we've got a really interesting lineup that I'm sure will stimulate some good questions and debate. I'll introduce each in turn before they start their presentations. So, to food security. We are expecting the government to launch its white paper on a food strategy sometime this month in response to the National Food Plan that was concluded sometime late last year. Since then, the war in Ukraine and its impact on supply chains and farm input availability and costs has raised the importance of both energy and food security to a level of key national and strategic importance. It's not just the UK that this is affecting, and Europe has already instigated a number of measures to safeguard food production. I, probably like most people out there, would hope that the conflict in Ukraine can be brought to an end. Whether that's possible or not, we'll have to wait and see. But I'm sure we'd love for this to be brought to an end. But whatever happens, it's surely important that nations across the world learn from this and put in place actions to become more food secure or food resilient. This time it's war, but in future, this type of disruption could be seen or caused by a host of other factors. Climate change and resource availability certainly come immediately to mind there. I guess food security can be achieved in one of two ways, or maybe a blend of both. Firstly, by being more self-sufficient and producing for our own needs, or secondly, by having as many trade deals as possible and being able to be in a position to buy food in. And of course, this option relies on us being wealthier than other nations, so that it's us that gets the food instead of other people in times of shortage. Of course, there is a third way, and that is about a blend of being more self-sufficient, raising our level of self-sufficiency and trading food around the world in both directions with other nations. That is all about balance. And whilst at the moment we're around 60% self-sufficient by value, you can easily argue that the direction of our land management policies at the moment risks taking significant areas of land out of production to meet tree planting targets, global warming targets, and nature recovery targets. But while having a roof over our heads and keeping warm and having plenty of food in our bellies are arguably the essentials of life, there can be little argument that having healthy environments and natural resources are equally essential, given they contribute to human health and are pretty fundamental to producing food in the long term. So again, this surely has to be about balance, and we need policies and markets that deliver the right balance. So without any further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Chris Donnelly. Chris has long worked as and is still a senior government advisor advising on national security and military issues. Chris has increasingly become aware that food and supply chains are critical to our security, and we've been working with them at the NSA over the last year to allow him to challenge and test his thinking. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Phil, and hello, everybody. I'm going to look at the bigger picture in the whole issue of food security. And although at the moment most of my work is concerned with Ukraine, and I'm happy to answer questions on detail, I'm going to start in a different place. I'm going to start firstly looking at global population. And that graph really says it all. It's an L-shaped graph. For 1,000 years, the world population was more or less the same, but more or less in my lifetime, it's quadrupled. And although I know I'm old, I'm not that old. And if we then look at the next slide, which is climate change, it's the same shaped graph. And the whole linkage between population and climate change is usually one which tends to be avoided because it's not politically correct. But it's important, obviously, and it's equally obvious that we can't put this back in the bottle. Now, the third slide looks at the way the whole world has changed, again, in my lifetime. In my lifetime, the central point of world affairs has gone from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And if you just hoist in what that slide actually says, it begins to give you an understanding of the extent to which the UK can expect in the future to be able to drive and direct world affairs. If we think that we will in the future have the same sort of influence and power to determine who's going to sell us their food, that I would think will be an unwise assumption. The focus of power in the world is not changing, it has shifted. The next slide is a subjective one. World changes all the time, but it doesn't change at the same rate and pace. And if you draw a graph like this one, showing the rate of change in the world, you'll notice there are flat bits when things don't change for a long period and steep bits when they change rapidly. And the steep bits all on that graph are wars, except now. 1914 to 1918, 1939 to 45 were periods of immense change. But for the last 15, 20 years, we've been going through a rate of change tantamount to being at war, and that rate of change is increasing and it's showing no signs of stopping. Purely, if you imagine that war isn't just killing, war is change. And when you have rapid change, you need a different way of doing things. You need wartime mentality, for want of a different word. Then we're at war, but with a peacetime mentality, because we haven't come to terms with this rate of change. And the issue of wars is that that rate of change overtakes the capacity of institutions to adapt. The main impact war has on society, and institutions that can't adapt and change go under in the face of rapid global change like that. And that's why you need strategy and a strategic approach. But strategy is not, it's often misunderstood. It's not a great big plan. Strategy is an interactive process of adaptation and change to match the challenges that rapid change brings you. And our problem in the UK is that for the last 20, 30 years, the government has not had a strategy process. It has formally not got now a national strategy for anything. To give you an example, if as you will probably know, there are now more obese people in the world than there are starving ones. And obesity is the NHS's biggest problem of cost. These are a list, if you like, of all the government's efforts over the last 30 years to tackle obesity. Different governments of all varieties, yeah, and making all those initiatives, all those efforts, all those strategies or policies to tackle obesity, and what effect has it had? None. Our national policy and strategy process is broken. The impact of change, the fact that it overtakes institutions' abilities to adapt, makes those institutions more and more impotent. And that's happened to our government. And in fact, it's happened to governments across the democratic world. We do have a problem. And when you've got governments which are less capable of adapting to this change, they collapse. The Arab Spring is a good example. And those Arab countries, the main cause of that collapse was food shortages in the Arab world. So government's becoming more and more impotent and needs more and more external input to help it to adapt and change and do things. It's short on knowledge. In the last 20, 30 years, the changes in government have meant that our senior civil service have become less and less expert in the areas they manage. It needs creative ideas, the ability to take risks. It needs impetus, a push. It needs to realize things are urgent. and it needs help to link what it does and its policies with the people, if you like, to sell them, to get the people on side. Now, we already therefore have a difficult situation of rapid global change. We've got the rise of China in the Far East. We've got climate change pushing on us, and we've had COVID. And in addition to all that, then we now have a real war in Ukraine. And that's been my main area of study. We've been watching as Russia has used energy as a weapon for decades. And over the last 5 to 6 years, it's been using wheat as a weapon, making itself an exporter of wheat, making itself the important country for many countries across the world, particularly in the Middle East, and now food dependent on Russian wheat. Egypt is a really important case in point. The second aspect of that is its dominance of the fertilizer market that helps everybody else grow food. Now, if Russia's the main exporter, Ukraine's been the second one in that region, also a large supplier of grain and fertilizer. So remove Ukrainian wheat and fertilizer from the market, and then, if necessary, add it to Russia. If Russia succeeds in overrunning and occupying Ukraine, which I think is unlikely, then it's even worse. We've got a perfect storm, a tipping point of destabilization. We've already got a large degree of global insecurity, of uncertainty, of disruption. Add to that then a shortage of food and a rise in food prices everywhere, and the knock-on effect onto the UK. This isn't a crisis. It's not something you can fix with crisis management, something temporary. This is a strategic challenge. This is not going to go away in a couple of weeks, even if they stop fighting in Ukraine. It needs a strategic response, and the government doesn't have a strategy process. And remember, strategy is a process, not a big plan. And for a strategy process to be national, it needs to be cross-party. It needs to bring the people with it. And it needs the intense involvement of business for expertise and implementation. And that's where the National Sheep Association comes in big time. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was fascinating and sobering as well, to be honest. And it all seems so logical and common sense that you do wonder quite why it's so difficult to get people to listen, really. I mean, one thing you said there towards the end about the fact that one of the problems we face may be that this isn't a crisis and therefore it's not getting adequate attention, yet the long-term importance of what you've said there is absolutely critical. Absolutely. So no, well, thank you very much for setting the scene in that way, Chris. And we'll move on now to our second speaker. And I'd like to introduce Adele Jones. Adele is Deputy CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust. Adele has been working with the Sustainable Food Trust, I think, for the last 9 years, working closely with its founder, Patrick Holden. As the name suggests, the Sustainable Food Trust is committed to sustainability in food production and are strong advocates for the importance of grazing livestock to sustainable food production and to the environment and nature as well. And I know, Adele, you've been working on a report or plans to look at food sustainability here in the UK. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Adele, and look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Phil, and good morning. Really, really good to not see you all because I can't see you, but see your names on the screen. It's a real pleasure to be here today. As Phil said, my name is Adele Jones. I work for the Sustainable Food Trust. A very quick intro to the Sustainable Food Trust. We're a small UK-based charity, but we have an international focus, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to more sustainable food and farming systems. And so I just wanted to bring up a few slides to frame what I was going to say today. Just shout at me if you can't see that, but hopefully you can.
That's perfect, Adele. Okay. Thank you.
So I wanted to I wanted to start today by thinking about, where we are in the world right now and what's going on, and think about it in the context of the question of, is this, particularly in light of the situation in Ukraine, is this crises that we're in a threat or an opportunity for agriculture, and specifically, let's talk about UK agriculture today. I think obviously you can't even begin to say that what's happening is a good thing, but I think we've got to take a sort of longer term view, and I think particularly, as Chris talked about, with the squeeze on fertilizer and other inputs, I think nitrogen is currently up by almost 4 times at the moment, which is a really interesting sort of thing to think about. And actually, I think it was a conversation that was happening anyway, but this situation has just sped it up by about 1,000 times. And so I think we've got to think, is this a moment of reset? Is this a tipping point, which is here quicker than perhaps we would have anticipated? But as much as we obviously need to make sure we do everything we can to help those in Ukraine and to help those farmers that are being directly impacted by this by these price rises at the moment, I think we've got to take a longer term view as well, and to question, well, there's a global situation going on in Ukraine, but we're also in a climate crisis, a nature crisis, and a public health crisis also, as Chris alluded to. And thinking about how we respond to that has to be in light of the short-term situation we find ourselves in, but also the long-term possible opportunities. So I just wanted to start by setting out what we believe sustainable agriculture to be. And we try and stay away from getting too hung up about terminology: regenerative, agroecology, climate smart, nature-friendly farming. We try and sort of stay away from terms because I think people are in different camps of what they believe to be right, and we try instead to think about the principles. And to us, sustainable, long-term sustainable agriculture means 3 key things. Firstly, farming in harmony with nature. So we're very much in the camp of nature and farming should be one and indivisible. We don't need to think about food production as being separate from nature, just around the edges, having nice hedgerows and nature reserves. We very much believe that nature needs to be integrated with food production. And by that, we're talking about natural biodiversity, but also agricultural biodiversity. So seeds, breeds, maintaining the gene pool as well. Secondly, we believe in the circular economy, so recycling nutrients and other things on farm as much as possible, trying as far as possible to create more closed loop systems rather than relying so heavily on external inputs, which are impacted by things like the Ukraine crisis. And thirdly, we believe in the principle of positive health. Food production should be resulting in better health of the environment, but also better health of people, both those who are on the land and those who eat the food. So that's just as a framing what we feel sustainable agriculture should look like in the future. And going back to this question of food security and short-term food security versus long-term food security, the thing we're trying to think about is how can we address this challenge in the context of everything else that's going on. And I think before the Ukraine crisis, and particularly because of COP26 in Glasgow in November, the buzzword a few months ago was carbon. How do we reach net zero? How do we make sure that every business, every farm, every government around the world is implementing policies to reach net zero? And our slight worry with this, particularly with agriculture, and I'm sure some of you have seen this graphic flying around, which I think is brilliant, is that if we just focus on one issue like carbon or food security, we're missing all the other stuff that's going on. And so we need to think about how we tackle these really big crises in the context of all these other things which we need to be taking account of as well. And that makes our lives quite complicated sometimes, but ultimately we won't reach the kind of the right end point if we don't take a more holistic view. And so I think just taking the example of carbon here, if we're focused or fixated on reaching net zero, there may well be unintended I've been speaking to various companies, and I was speaking to a restaurant chain last week who were talking about the fact that they'd switched one of their cheese suppliers from a fairly intensive operation in Europe to an extensive farmer based in the north of England. And the carbon emissions for that particular cheese, which they then put a carbon score on their label, as a result of making that decision to switch from intensive to extensive, the carbon score went up, as in that it was higher. And they were thinking, oh God, we thought we were making the right decision here. And actually what's happened is the carbon score for this particular menu item has gone up. What on earth is that all about? And so, if you have animals used that live for longer, the carbon score is going to be higher per kilogram of product because they live for longer. It's just a fact. Whereas if you're taking into account all the other positive, hopefully, impacts that more extensive system was having, biodiversity creation or maintenance, employing people on the land, clean water, clean air, all these other really important things that farmers deliver, then actually you can create a much more complete picture as to why that was the better choice for that restaurant chain to make. So we're working on a project called the Global Farm Metric, which is about creating a common set of metrics for measuring whole farm sustainability. And we feel strongly that if you take this more holistic approach to thinking about the solutions, so this covers the economic, the environmental, and the social elements of sustainability on farms, you can start making choices that hopefully will provide benefit to each of those areas. We can't think about the profitability of farms without thinking now about the environmental impact and the social impact. And so we've got to make decisions based on these things in the round. So there's more information on this project on our website, and the website for the Global Farm Metric specifically is globalfarmmetric.org. But again, if we're all using a common set of metrics to measure and report on progress, we can obviously, you all hopefully can have a common language to help understand how you can, make incremental steps to being better each year. And I know many of you will be subject to multiple different audits each year, perhaps asking for this, very similar information in a slightly different way, quite binary in nature. You have to reach this standard to get this certification. And actually what we need now is a framework which allows any farmer to enter at any point in their journey and understand what steps they can make in each of the areas of sustainability each year. We're advocating for this to be part of the new ELM scheme and equivalents in the devolved nations, because we feel that farmers need to understand how that ELMS money can help them improve, but Treasury need to know how well that taxpayers' money is being spent as well in terms of the delivery of public goods. We're also working with food companies to, as I mentioned, to help them make more holistic, informed decisions about supply chains. And finally, we're also working with the finance sector, so banks and investors, because they have very significant levers to pull, I think, in helping us make this sustainable agriculture transition over the next few years. But back to the question of food security, and thinking about the UK or Great Britain as a case study. As Phil mentioned, we are working on a report at the moment, taking this holistic approach to thinking about the solution, but asking the question, how can we align our diets with the productive capacity of genuinely sustainable farming systems in the UK? So rather than trying to think about a diet that's, could save the world, could be the solution to climate change, or could be the solution to the public health crisis, we are asking the question, well, what do the farms look like that are the solution to climate, nature and health, and food security obviously as well. And so what we've done is used the kind of categories of the Global Farm Metric and created a model to basically superimpose sustainable regenerative farms across the whole of the UK, kind of projecting forward 10 years, let's say. If we go on this sustainable agriculture journey, what will our farms look like in all the different regions of the UK? And that's based on soil types, land grades, climate, everything. We've tried to take quite a lot of parameters into account to understand what the farms would look like in different parts of the UK. if we followed the three principles that we mentioned earlier. And from that, we've then looked at, okay, well, what would the productive capacity of those farms be? How much food would we produce and in what ratios? And then notionally, if we as citizens of the UK were to align our diets with the productive capacity of these sustainable farms, what would our sort of staple, the staple food parts of our diets look like? And we're not sort of trying to be nanny state and say everyone needs to only eat British food. I think we'll all still want our bananas and chocolate and coffee, but just thinking more about how we as citizens can support our farmers in this country. And so the report hasn't been released yet. We're in the horrific stage of trying to do the final edits and kind of draw a line under our model, because as you can imagine, there's a million different things you could put into this model, and we're having to kind of sort of at some stage say, right, let's just draw a line on it and get it out there. And it won't be perfect, it will never be finished, but this is just a sort of starting point for discussion. But these are the sort of very basic headlines. I didn't want to give you exact numbers because that would spoil the surprise when it comes out in a few weeks' time. But basically, as a result of transitioning to sustainable regenerative farming systems, we would see a significant fall in grain production because we would move back to mixed farming. So that would mean more grass layers in the east, grazed by beef and sheep, more arable and vegetable and fruit production in the west. So kind of mixing it all up wherever possible. Obviously, that's not possible in the uplands, but where possible, moving back to mixed farming so we can rely less heavily on external inputs. That doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the amount of grain-based products that we eat, but it has a big impact on the amount of feed that we produce for particularly indoor raised pork and poultry. So pork and poultry production and consumption would drop dramatically. But the key thing here is that predominantly grass-fed beef and lamb levels remain the same, if not actually go up slightly as a result of this system. So we're trying to kind of make sure that the general public start understanding that not all meat is the same. And actually, when you think about the ecological impact, it's actually the intensively raised pork and poultry which are having the biggest impact, because the feed is either grown in the UK or on the other side of the world, and that's having a very big impact both on the environment and our food security. So those are the very, very broad and crude conclusions from the report. There'll obviously be a load more detail, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour, and hopefully that will set us up for an interesting discussion for the rest of this session. But thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adele. Incredibly thought-provoking stuff there. So thanks very much for that. And yeah, I've often felt that we've suffered from what we've called silo working, really. But the slide that you had, the tunnel vision, is exactly the same, where we just focus on one issue and lose sight of so many others. But no, that's great. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm sure that will help to get a debate going later on as well. And I'd like now to pass over to our final speaker, Nicholas Safar. Nicholas has worked in the food industry for many, many years and is now chairman of AHDB. Nicholas hadn't got any slides, so he's just going to really talk. And I'd like you to reflect, Nicholas, really on what what you've heard from both Chris and Adele. How do you see these challenges that we're facing? How do we make the case for the importance of a higher level of food security, but alongside making sure that our natural ecosystems and natural resources are protected and better enhanced? What does industry need if it is to respond to these challenges? And how do we reconcile all this with government's current policy, which you could argue leans us towards having high standards and exporting premium products into premium markets, while also easing the way for lower price imports to feed our people? And I guess in addition to all of that, we are the National Sheep Association, so it'd be great to hear from you one or two reflections of how the sheep industry fits with this as well. Lamb is really interesting, isn't it? In that, if you look at the total volumes produced and consumed, we're more or less in balance, give or take 10,000 tons of close on 300,000 tons of production and consumption. We're more or less in balance, but we do export and import. I mean, I've believed for a long time that if we wanted to, we could restructure our industry to be self-sufficient, but there's absolutely no doubt that trade drives competition, and competition drives prices in the marketplace, and prices mean that farmers have the money to improve their systems and invest as well. So that trade has been highly, highly valuable. But anyway, yeah, I'm not here to talk. I'm here to hold things together and to chair, really. So, Nicholas, I'll pass over to you and look forward to a few of your reflections, please.
Well, thanks, Phil, and good morning, everybody. All in 8 minutes. That's quite a tall order. Can I start off by saying, go back to Chris. I actually am the son of a Ukrainian immigrant. My mother came from Ukraine in 1918 with her parents, and my grandparents were millers in the Ukraine at the time when it was very much already the breadbasket of Europe. So I watch what's going on with more than a bystander's interest. But coming back to it, trying to pick up some of the messages from Chris, which are always really interesting, and also trying to address some of Adele's points. And it's quite interesting, by the way. I've known Patrick for many years, and I think the journey Patrick's been on has been incredible, from being quite an ideologue to actually being very practical now about how to deal with these issues in a sensible way. But what I am going to do is I'm going to actually, Phil, take this really from a point of view of what does it mean for a sheep farmer. I am quite passionate, as you know, about sheep. But it's complex, and I think we need to just think about that for a minute. Can I also just address one point made by Chris, and that is that we have no strategy in this country about anything. I think that's partly true. We are good muddlers. We come through somehow, but we come through late. And I think that the only thing I'd say to you is, do not expect from this white paper a great blueprint for a strategy for the future. I think it will be short, it will be top line, and it will try and make token gestures to everybody without finally answering the problem. And that's why I want to be more practical about it. The only thing I would say is there is an underlying ideology in the UK, which we must not forget, towards agriculture and food. And it goes back to the repeal of the Corn Laws, 1846. This country is an importer of food. It sees the world as a supplier, particularly the old colonies and the Commonwealth as a supplier. And I don't see that changing. You can see that in these free trade agreements. We are essentially a country that believes that the world can supply us. And that is really interesting in the context of Chris's point about the demographic changes in the world and the wealth of the Far East. Because the Far East is going to be a real competitor for the buying of food from Australia and New Zealand, which is of particular relevance when you start looking at sheep, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So what's the long-term trend? Long-term trend, 2% increase around the world per annum in the consumption of red meat, which is quite different from where we are in the UK, or likely to be in the UK. As I said before, New Zealand, Australia, big potential historic suppliers and potential suppliers of sheep, very much focused now on Far East, where the wealth is, where the growth of the market is, and I think that's important to recognise. As far as and by the way, the February figures for imports and exports for this country, just last February, begin to indicate something quite interesting. For the first time in 2 years, we're back to quite large import-export figures. And when you look at, so if you look at exports up 37%, peculiarly, everybody said Europe, which is our largest market, is going to be a real problem. It's still Europe that is the main export market. We haven't broken out of that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at imports, this is where I think there is an interesting change. Imports up 66%, but the biggest single import is from Ireland. It isn't from Australia or New Zealand, as you would have expected in the past. And I think that that's a clear indication of the strength of the Far East market, amongst other things. If we take to the domestic market, we've got all sorts of tensions here. The biggest one, of course, is the move away from, or the gradual approach to the move away from the consumption of red meat. And I think what's interesting there is that over the last 2 years, that actually hasn't happened with the AHDB We Eat Balanced campaign, which is not an attempt to get people to eat more meat. It's actually to get people to recognize the role of meat in the diet and the challenges we've made with the Advertising Standard Agency to some of the disinformation that has been around. We've actually been very successful And meat consumption is not in decline at this moment in time. I think it will be, but I don't think it is at this moment in time. I think that it really is about an honest appraisal of the role of meat. And I think Adele makes the point, there is a real role for pasture-fed, for balance, for use of animals in rotation, etc. The other thing to remember is that the large corporates are really interested in plant-based foods. And the reason they're really interested is because they can be converted into branded products, unlike primary products. And that's where the margin is. And that's where they can start advertising. And that is why you will see major thrusts around plant-based foods in the future. So can we defy gravity? I think that we've got a big problem coming at us. Kantar's latest April figures show a 4.5% decline in food consumption, in food expenditure. I think that's a sign of the time. That will hurt red meat. I think in exports, we will see the maintaining of strong markets in Europe. We do have opportunities coming at us, as you know, in America and Canada, which I think are important, although don't overestimate them. Australia and New Zealand are established suppliers. We are going to be opening up Taiwan, China, Japan, and in the long term, Vietnam, Mexico, and Chile. But this can't be about commodity. It has to be about something that's different. It has to be about provenance. It has to be about animal welfare. It has to be all of those things. And don't forget the role of halal in terms of our exports, which is absolutely critical. So I think we have a goal, which is to actually keep on maintaining and developing export markets. And with growth of red meat consumption, I think that's quite possible. I think that if we look at the UK in terms of farming now, I think that the question is really going to be what damage, what change will come about through the reduction in direct farm payments. And if you look at the AHDB analysis on ELMS, it shows quite clearly that anybody who is expecting ELMS to replace direct farm payments has got a problem coming. The analysis shows both on grassland and on arable that at these levels of ELMS proposed payments, you've either got to be doing what the public goods require at this moment in time to make it worthwhile, or you've actually got to be incredibly sophisticated in choosing which land you're going to put over to ELMS. But otherwise, there is no real net income positive in that area. Investors are buying land for carbon offset and hedging. The DAs are going to be very interesting, the devolved authorities. The Welsh and Scottish move towards reforesting of the hills is going to have an effect on red meat production, particularly lamb. But generally, I would say we should not expect policy coming forward that is going to either underpin farming of lamb, red meat, or big changes that are going to come from policy that are going to affect us. So really, at the end of the day, I think it's for us to make sure that we are in a fit state to be able to live with whatever, in practical terms, comes at us. And I think that is where we clearly, in terms of marketing, we've got to support reputation in the home market. And that means when we do support reputation, we have to produce to that reputation. And I think that is one of the key issues for the future about what we are going to produce, how we're going to produce it, and the fact that we can defend it when we aren't saying that we are better than other people. Because actually, New Zealand's not bad. So, you know, don't just think that our welfare is excellent. So I think that we've got to really look at ourselves as well. We've got to look at our grassland management to maximize output, minimize input. This current fertilizer issue is just the beginnings of where we've got to get to. We've got to look at our livestock management. We've got to reduce lameness. We've got to reduce disease. We've got to stop using antibiotics and excessive worming. All of these things can be done by actually improving the way we manage our animals. So I think that the key for me is don't expect somebody to come with a silver bullet. I think that Chris's point is absolutely right. We are in for volatility and change, and strategy is to a great extent about adaptation and ability to deal with it. And I think a lot of it's in our hands. We should not be looking just to government. So I think that's an opener from me, but it's such an enormous subject. I'm sure there'll be questions, Phil.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Just to pick up on one thing you said, and again, we can open this as a discussion amongst everyone if we'd like to, really. But you know, I'm sure you're right in that the loss of the basic payment will have a really large impact on change of land use and change of farming practice. But the one thing that does seem to be coming along, you touched on, really, is carbon credits and payment for ecosystem services. And I'm increasingly concerned that the case is always being made for carbon credits and payment for ecosystem services based on non-farming activity. And we still haven't really won that battle about trying to explain farming, or maybe establish the evidence for farming to make the case that we can deliver both at the same time, and we can deliver good carbon sequestration levels and good levels of carbon storage on farms through better habitat and hedgerow management and the like as well, through farming, rather than having to go out of farming. But certainly all the media noise at the moment is very much around farms being bought to plant trees to offset carbon, rather than to farm in a sustainable way to try and get the balance of food production and deliver to those other climate change goals.
Yeah, I mean, if I can come back on that one, Phil, I think we've spent far too much time arguing about which carbon measurement tools are the right tools, rather than concentrating on that particular subject. You're absolutely right. I mean, actually, one of the problems with forestation is that it is no quick answer. And many years ago, I looked at forestry for a different reason. And one of the problems we have in the UK is actually we don't have a forestry industry. So you can plant trees, unless, going back to Chris's point, unless you have a strategy, you can plant trees, but unless you actually do something with that wood when it actually grows, then you're not actually solving any problems. The Germans have an incredibly integrated forestry approach where they have an industry. The Americans have the same, the Scandinavians have the same. So I'm very worried about forestation. I think the only thing I'd say to you is I actually do not believe that there is going to be a carbon bonus here for farming that is going to replace the need to be able to farm profitably and sensibly, and also to be able to do it in a way in which consumers are going to recognize that we have something that they want. We mustn't just look at commodity production. We mustn't just look at being able to up our yields. We've got to look at what's different, what we can do about our pastures. And then within that, I agree with you, pasture has an enormous role to play in terms of carbon capture.
Thanks, Nicola. Adele, would you like to pass any comments on that subject as well, and maybe talk a little bit about how the global farm metric could be used as a communications tool to explain the good that comes from farming, and also maybe just one of the things that I guess a lot of farmers will be concerned about is that audit process. You mentioned that, but how long does it take? How long does the global farm metric take for a farmer to go through?
Well, to answer your second question first, basically, we have a self-assessment version of the global farm metric. It's pretty rustic in terms of technology. It takes anywhere from about sort of 2 to 3 hours to half a day to fill in, depending on sort of how together the information is. But ultimately, we're not in this to create a piece of tech. We want to develop a framework, and that's really the reason for developing our self-assessment tool, was providing a platform for farmers to be able to give us feedback on the framework. The theory of change for us is this common framework should be integrated in multiple different tech platforms, could also be applied by the certifiers as well. So if everyone's using the same framework to measure, there could be lots of different ways that's applied on a farm, depending on your situation, your location. I think it's unrealistic to think everyone will use the same bit of software. So it takes roughly half a day, but we're ultimately hoping to link with, for example, the certification schemes, so that you only have to collect that information once. So it hopefully would become an integrated audit in time, which would save lots of time and money and bureaucracy for everyone. But to your first question, sorry, about the carbon credits, I agree with Nicholas. I don't think it's ever going to replace the fact that we need to find ways of producing food profitably within the carrying capacity of our landscape. So producing food whilst not degrading natural capital, to use jargon terms. But I do think there's a real opportunity here, and I think again, as Nicholas said, I think the percentage of funding that comes from government will shrink naturally over time, which is again why we need to keep making the case to Treasury that paying farmers to deliver public goods is a good use of taxpayers' money. Otherwise, I think that that budget will continue to be squeezed. But I think, you know, we've got to think about that, you know, where we're going with opportunities for farmers. And I think it's going to move away from being, you know, let's say 50% single farm payment with some stewardship, and then 50%, you know, whatever you make from selling your produce. I think we need to think maybe a third in terms of government money shrinking, but perhaps this opportunity starting to open up from the private sector. And I think the introduction of a soil carbon code is going to be really significant. At the moment, there's a woodland carbon code and a peatland carbon code, which allows for carbon trading to happen in those areas at a much bigger scale. But until we have this soil carbon code, it's going to be really hard to regulate that market. So that's a really big important part of the puzzle. But I think, again, you know, we've got to look beyond carbon. If we just incentivize carbon, whether it's through trees or soil, there will be, you know, other consequences. And so we need to take a more holistic approach. But I think there's a huge opportunity for farmers to tap into these new funding revenues, but we need to make sure it's done in the right way, because it is a bit of a cowboy market right now.
Thanks, Adele. That's great. Before I move on to one or two comments and Q&As that have come in as well, Chris, just to pass over to you, how far is this conversation straying away from the issue of really secure foods production and supply chains to protect our national security? And I guess that's when you get into the whole debate around you know, government driving the agenda and policy driving the agenda as much as a free market that Nicholas was talking more about.
Yes. The more you look at it, the more you realize that you can't just leave it to a free market. There has to be intervention. And the more you realize how complex the whole issue of food security is. At the one end, it's an element of national security in its widest sense, and needs a navy and a military to protect sea lines of communication to bring the food to us. The other aspect of that is if climate change goes the way it looks, it's going to have a really big impact, the most impact, on countries close to the equator, where a lot of our food comes from. And as it affects those countries, it creates destabilization in them. And that it creates migrants. So we're then faced with the problem. What do we do? Do we go to those countries and help them fix their stability problems, which may require some military assistance? That's at one end. At the other end is the issue of diet, and the fact that we have a diet at the moment which is costing the country billions of pounds a year through the problems of obesity and ill health, and which creates great differences north and south. So the whole issue of food security is absolutely interwoven into every aspect of how the UK is run. And it just isn't something you can just leave to market forces.
But Chris, you've also said that despite repeated government initiatives to address obesity, everything has failed, you know, and we're still heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, because we don't have a national, we have chosen not to have national strategy. The government chose 25 years ago to do away with the concept, and we have to bring it back. But the other aspect of that is, even if we do bring it back, government will get out of the idea that government can now solve all the problems. The world's too complex for that. We have to start solving problems at the grassroots level, if you excuse the pun. Yeah? And doing things for ourselves. For too long, we've had a holiday from history. We've lived in a secure, rules-based environment. We've let the government do things. And now we can see that, in fact, that was wrong. It's screwed up a lot of things. We have to have a lot more public participation in everything. And industry, whether it's manufacturing industry or whether it's a food industry, has to have a much larger voice in what goes on and take responsibility for it.
Good, thanks, Chris. Let's just go back to one or two comments and questions that have come in. Tony Goodge has made a really important point, I think, about, well, it's about circular economies, really, and avoiding waste. So as part of any strategy, we must avoid waste, not just the waste of food, but the waste in all UK production. For example, too few AD plants capture CO2, and yet we lunge from one CO2 crisis to another. We don't make the best use of abattoir slurry and sludge as fertilizer, etc. When you don't value something, they tend to waste it. The value may not be immediately seen to some, and yet it is in the front of mind to others. That brings to mind a webinar that I was involved in last week on circular economies around wool, and the fact that we've, wool has lost so much value over these last decades. And actually, to the extent that we've got quite a growing number of farmers that are starting to think that wool shedding sheep or hair sheep are the way forward. And it just makes me wonder how long it will be before we start to see wool as a really valuable resource that has got some value as an alternative to synthetic fibers. It's we're in some ways we're thinking about limiting our production rather than trying to increase the value and the output from our farms. It's a really interesting subject. But circular economies, again, Adele, the global farm metric is looking at farms. It looks like you've got options there for caterers and retailers and processors and the like. Is there a need to bring it together, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, food waste at all levels of the supply chain is such a massive issue and such an inefficiency, actually, that we can actually correct fairly easily in comparison to some of the other issues we're facing. So I think that's a huge opportunity. I think the wool example is great. I've been wondering recently about this whole Insulate Britain thing and whether there's a way we can sort of make use of that, with the fuel poverty situation we're now facing as well. Whether there's a way wool can have a renaissance with insulation. But I think fats is another key thing as well. We actually burn or incinerate a lot of animal fats around the back of abattoirs as well. And actually, when you consider that a lot of our fats are coming from plants produced in industrial ways, like palm oil, it's really shocking, actually. And animal fats have very similar kind of cooking qualities to palm oil. So we really need to be thinking about how we live off the fat of our own land instead of the fat of the Indonesian rainforest or wherever it might be. So I think, circular economy is going to be a really important factor for us to consider.
And Nicholas, I'm not sure if you're an expert in this world or not really, but in terms of our processors, our land processors, I feel that they've put a huge amount of effort in over the years to try and balance and to maximize or optimize the value of all of our carcass parts by placing products in different markets. Fifth quarter products that would have at one time been wasted now are finding markets in other parts of the world. They've worked hard, but we all need to work harder, I guess.
Yeah, as an aside, it's very interesting, isn't it? The best market in the world and a really important market for chicken feet is China. It's really the most important area for people to make that extra margin of profit. It's how do you deal with the fifth quarter? And I think you're right. I think by and large the trade does it well, but we've got to maintain those markets open. So I think that from an HDB, from an industry point of view, there is a role for exports. There's a really important role for exports. It keeps the home market honest. It allows you to deal with the various parts of the animal. But equally, I think it's about defending the home market, and particularly in sheep. If you look at the volume of sheep meat that we do import into this country, there's every reason to believe that we can actually take more of that market. We did do over the last 2 years. There's a couple of interesting points, though, Phil, if I may, in the chat. One is Tony's about halal, and I agree completely. I think halal is a really important opportunity for us in both the home market and export. And if I may, Peter McCann's come up with a point about Irish governments agreed a veterinary health certificate for sheep meat exports to USA. When will the UK government do the same? I think that comes back to Chris's point about strategies. the UK government is not about regulation. And if you look at the regulations that are imposed on exports, forget about America for a minute, they tend to have been imposed by the importing country. So we as HDB spend an enormous amount of time working with abattoirs on getting them certified for Chinese exports because of Chinese standards, not because of UK export standards. So there is a big question there about whether, if we truly are going to build up a provenance and reputation for British exports, British meat exports particularly, whether we actually have to start certifying in that way. And then the question is whether it's regulatory or whether it's voluntary. And I think that's an area we're going to have to get into now very urgently.
Mm. And the issue of, again, whenever, so many people see that word halal and it puts the fear of animal welfare into their minds as well. But we have to remember that still the vast majority of halal sheep are pre-slaughter stunned as well, so they in the main they would be produced to the same standards as all of our other and slaughtered and processed in the same way as all of our other lamb in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is an emotive subject, and it's one that everybody avoids talking about. But actually, it's one that the real problem around it is not about halal. It's about the issue of the British public not liking to think about meat being from animals. I remember when I first started Food from Britain, which is a long time ago now. I remember the first lesson I was told was, if you're going to promote British meat exports to France, make sure you put photos of the live animal on grass out on at the retail level so people can see where it comes from. And the second lesson was, never show a British consumer a live animal on grass. But very interestingly, Phil, in that recent Wheat Balance campaign, if for those of you who saw it on television, it was all about animals in a living environment. It was all about rolling hills. It was all about grass. It was all about animals, and it went down very well. I mean, the improvement in consumption was significant. So I think that there is a change there, and I think, going back to Adele's point, I think that people are beginning to recognise that well-produced meat off grass is something that they can enjoy, and they can enjoy it without feeling guilty. And I think that's a really important message for the future.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, entirely. Yeah, and I think we have, if you think about where we are now compared to 10 years and 20 years ago, we have made strides there, haven't we? If you look at so many programs on TV about, our Yorkshire farm and our Snowdonia farm more recently, and all the cookery programs that are talking about ways to cook lamb. A lot of these things didn't exist, so we should never lose sight of the fact that we are making headway, and sometimes I suppose it's inevitable. We're all impatient. We'd like to see things change more quickly, I guess. But we are making strides, I think. Okay, Adele, just a comment there about a trade. I've said that that import and export trade, certainly from our perspective, the export trade is really valuable to our industry. The import and export volumes do play a role in balancing products out, I guess, and balancing seasonality as well. That trade is not bad, is it?
No, definitely not. And our report is really a conversation starter about whether or not we should be thinking about, as I said, aligning our diets with the productive capacity of the land around us, rather than relying so heavily on food from the other side of the world. But of course, trade is a really good thing. I think in future we just need to think about trade deals which are based on relative levels of sustainability rather than political sort of which issues of the moment, as it were, to make sure we're not undercutting our farmers here at home. So I think another use case of a common framework and a common language for understanding sustainability, not just in the UK but globally, is to potentially hang future trade deals off that scale, because ultimately we should have a language much like the financial accounting protocols, which are largely the same all over the world, so that every farmer, whether you're in Kenya, Australia or Yorkshire, can have a conversation about where your soil health is at, or where your animal welfare is at. And I think that's the really kind of golden prize here that we can then use for other things like trade deals in future as well. But obviously, we've got quite a journey to go on to get to that point. But I think it's the way it has to go.
And interestingly, for all the spotlight that we try to put on standards in relation to new trade deals, Australia and New Zealand in particular, we at the NSA are part of a global sheep producers forum that are actually meeting tonight to talk about sustainability criteria, sustainability metrics, and everyone, from the Australians to New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Americans, ourselves, some of the South American countries, are starting to talk in a similar language, even though the way they look at these things might be slightly different. But it's got to be a healthy thing and a good thing that the conversation is happening. Definitely,
and I think the opportunity is to move away from standards which are kind of opaque in terms of they say they represent something, but actually what do they represent? And I think we've got to move towards sort of impact measurements, so that we can really stand behind our claims of saying, well, British produce really is delivering on X, Y, and Z, because at the moment it's a little bit sort of subjective, I think, when it comes down to the audits. So if we can move towards those impact measures, I think it will allow us to all move in the same direction.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adele. Listen, it's 9:30, just gone, and I know that one or two people have got to leave to do other things. So I think we'll draw this Breakfast Club session to a close now. Again, as ever, it's been a really fascinating session, and I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. I wouldn't even dream of thinking how you might summarize this. I'm not even going to attempt to, really, but we're all on a journey together and we've all got a long way to go. And, I think where we are, I guess, is in a much better place in terms of recognizing the importance of food security more generally. For a long time now, I think the focus has been on climate change and environment, and food production, food security has had a very low level of priority, and that is changing now. And if we can get back to a place where actually we've got a balance between all those things when we're talking about our objectives and aspirations for the future, it'll be a very good thing. So I will close now, and I'd like to finally thank Roy Thorns again very much for sponsoring these webinars, and again a huge thank you to Chris and to Adele and to Nicholas as this morning's speakers. We're going to be taking a break from NSA Breakfast Club now to allow us to focus on sheep 2022. That's going to take place here at Morven on the Three Counties Showground on the 27th of July. I hope to see as many of you there as possible. It'll be a really good day, a very vibrant day, and full of lots of activities. So if you can make it, please do. We'll be back again in September. I think that's our plan, that we'll return back in September with our monthly breakfast clubs. And in the meantime, I hope I'll see as many of you on the 27th of July at Morven. And with that, I just wish you all a really good morning and goodbye for now. So thank you.